Okay, so this is actually muscle tissue part C, so chapter 9C, and we're going to look at things like the force of muscle contraction. So really, a single muscle, a muscle like the biceps or a muscle like the triceps, what influences the force of the contraction? So the number one thing is the number of fibers recruited, the number of motor units uh, in that particular contraction. Uh, and then the size of the fibers. So if there's hypertrophy, as if you've been working out and the cells are increased in size and there are more myofibrils, you're going to get a much stronger um, contraction out of it. Now, you are also going to get a stronger contraction if the frequency of stimulation uh, goes up. Now, this is an interesting concept. When a muscle contracts, the first thing that has to happen is it has to overcome what are called the series elastic elements. It has to overcome the stretch that's in the tendons. It has to overcome the stretch within the muscle cell itself. And so the part of the force of the contraction is used to overcome this tendency for these tissues to stretch. Now, if the next contraction comes while that tissue is still stretched, then the majority of the force from the second contraction can be used in moving the load. A low frequency of stimulation means that you have to overcome that stretch each contraction and you lose a lot of efficiency. So high frequency of stimulation leads to more force. Now, the other thing, and this is a little bit of counterintuitive, is the amount of overlap between the thin and thick filaments. If the thin and thick filaments are hardly overlapping at all, you can't get very many cross bridges, so you really don't get very much contraction. And similarly, if there's too much, then there's no place for the thin filaments to go towards the middle, and you lose any force of contraction because you can't shorten any further. So there's this length relationship. It works out that it's between 80 and 120 of their normal resting length. I'll talk about that in a second. So lots of fibers, the fibers being large, lots of stimulation, high frequency, and a good length increases contractile force. It's interesting. I talk to people all the time, especially guys that lift weights, and I try and convince them that it's good for their health to stretch before they lift weights. And compliance is very low. Once I realized that if you can convince them that stretching before actually means they become 20% stronger and they get to lift 20% more weight, they're all for it, and they're very high compliance. So really, by stretching and going to 120% of the length, so of resting length, you actually can contract to 80% of the length, which is a 40% change. If you don't stretch beforehand and you contract from 100% of resting length to 80% of resting length, you only get a 20% change. And it really has to do with the number of cross bridges that can form because of the overlap between the thin and thick filaments. 80 to 120, so there's a 40% chance optimally. So, not all muscle fibers react the same. A lot of it depends on the type of fiber it is, the amount of load, and how much recruitment there's going on. So we'll start out by talking about fiber type. Now, fiber type, there's two ways to do it. One way is the speed of contraction, whether they're fast or slow twitch fibers. And really, that's how fast does the ATP split and energize the myosin head. If that's a slow process, then it'll take longer for the contraction to happen. If it's a fast process, then it will be faster. So we have fast and slow, right? The other way is the metabolic pathways. How do you make ATP? Oxidative pathways, the aerobic pathways, use oxygen, and they're relatively slow because there's a lot of steps. But they make a lot of ATP, so there's more endurance in them. The glycolytic fibers use anaerobic pathways, and therefore only make 2 ATPs. They don't have a lot of endurance, but they can generate ATP quickly. So we call them oxidative and glycolytic fibers. So if we put these two ideas together, we end up with slow oxidative fibers, fast oxidative fibers, and fast glycolytic fibers. Now, theoretically, there's a slow glycolytic fiber, but that doesn't make any sense because the point of glycolysis is that it's fast. So why would you have a slow reacting fiber needing glycolysis? So they just don't exist. So slow oxidative fibers take a while to energize the myosin head. So they use ATP more slowly. And oxidative means that they make a lot of ATP, but it takes time. Fast oxidative fibers they hydrolyze the ATP quickly, but they primarily use oxidative techniques. But they're going to fatigue a little bit quicker. You're going to run out of ATP sooner. Fast glycolytic will make a lot of lactic acid, and they will work very quickly. So really, the advantage to fast glycolytic is you can develop a lot of power quickly, but it fatigues very soon. So when we look at them and we compare them, we're going to see some interesting things. Slow oxidative fibers react slowly. The myosin ATPase is slow. They make lots of ATP aerobically, so they need lots of oxygen. So they store lots of oxygen in myoglobin. So the meat is very red. They make 36 ATPs out of each glucose, so they don't need to store a lot of glucose because they're getting a good high yield out of it. They store some, but not a lot. We use them first because they last the longest. They're fatigue resistant. So we use this when we're doing endurance activities, marathons, when your calf muscles, when you're standing a long time. These are red fibers. Now, because they have to get a lot of oxygen to the center, to the mitochondria, they tend to be very thin fibers. They're small diameter. And there's lots of mitochondria, and there's lots of blood supply because mitochondria make the ATP aerobically, and the capillaries deliver the oxygen and the glucose that's needed. They don't need to store glucose. Now, fast oxidative fibers are fast, right? They're aerobic, some anaerobic. They have a good amount of myoglobin, so they're pretty red. They store some glycogen because they're going to do some anaerobic, right? We use them second, and they're moderately fatigue resistant. So we use this and when we go for long walks and things like that. We call them the pink fibers. The fiber diameters aren't as small as the slow oxidative, but they're not as big as the others. Lots of mitochondria, lots of capillaries, good blood supply. So we tend to think that the majority of the fibers in a muscle are of these type. The third type are the fast glycolytic, and it's fast. It gets everything from anaerobic. It doesn't need to store myoglobin because it doesn't use oxygen. It stores a lot of glycogen because it's only getting 2 ATP out of a glucose. So we need lots of it. And we can't deliver it because there's not a lot of blood vessels. There's very few capillaries. There's very few mitochondria because we're not using them. The fibers can be really big and really thick because we're trying to develop a lot of power quickly. So there's a lot of myofibrils in it. They fatigue quite quickly. So this is powerful, intense movements. This is powerlifting. This is hitting a baseball. This is things that require a lot of strength very quickly. Now, probably the easiest way to think of all of this is when you think about turkeys. Turkeys are big, heavy birds. They don't fly worth a crap. They don't go very far flying. So their breast meat, their flight muscles, are all fast glycolytic fibers. There's very few blood vessels. There's a lot of glycogen. There's not very much myoglobin. So that's why the meat is starchy. The fibers are big. When you think of white meat fibers, they're thick, grainy. It's a thick, grainy meat. It's very starchy because there's lots of glycogen. It's white because there's very low myoglobin. Now, turkeys spend a lot of time walking around, and they're big, heavy birds, so they need to not have their legs fatigued. So leg meat on turkey is slow oxidative. It's dark with lots of myoglobin. The fibers are very fine. They have lots of capillaries and lots of fat and things around. So their walking is an endurance activity. Their flying is definitely a very short-term burst sort of activity. Now, if you contrast that with duck meat, ducks fly huge long distances, and they don't walk around very much. They kind of swim and float. So, so their leg meat is fast oxidative or slow or glycolytic, but their breast meat is red meat. It is slow oxidative primarily because they need the endurance for it. Just a decent way of remembering this. Now, any given muscle in the body will have a mixture of all of these types of fibers. Which fiber predominates is based upon A, your genetics and what you're born with, because fibers can't switch between one and the other, and B, which fibers you are actually developing and that undergo hypertrophy because of the activities you're doing. So if you are doing if you're weightlifting, powerlifting, you will probably build bulk with these fast glycolytic fibers. If you are marathon running, you won't bulk up. You're going to be developing your slow oxidative fibers. And that's why a marathoner looks skinny compared to a powerlifter. Just think of the morphology of those two different athletes. So this is just having a look at that. When we look at a photomicrograph, you see that they're mixed within the muscle. Some muscles are very lopsided in their mix, and others are more balanced in their mix. So this is a slide looking at the influence of the load. So if there's a big load, it takes a while before you can start moving the load. Like you have to recruit a lot. and you're going to fatigue earlier. So it basically looks like this. A light load starts to move sooner, and you can actually hold it for a much longer period of time. Whereas a heavy load takes longer before you can move it, and you can only do it for a shorter period of time. That just makes sense. If you can recruit more, you counteract this effect. So what happens when you exercise? If you exercise aerobically, you grow more capillaries. You increase the number of mitochondria. You make more myoglobin in the red fibers. You get greater endurance, greater resistance to fatigue. You can actually move fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative fibers by growing more mitochondria. The thing is that what you can't do is turn them into slow fibers because you can't change the enzyme. But by growing more mitochondria and maybe more myoglobin, you can convert fast oxidative into fast oxidative from fast glycolytic. If you do anaerobic, you end up with muscle hypertrophy. So muscles increase in size. This is why light load, lots of reps, gives you endurance. Heavy load, fewer reps, gives you size. So when you overwork a muscle, you adapt to the increased demands and you grow more myofibrils. And that is really what causes the hypertrophy, is this kind of overload effect. Now, the rest of this slide presentation is smooth muscle, so I'll continue it in a different video.